As we mentioned last week, today we're beginning a series of homilies on theology of the body. So, theology of the body is about God's plan for human sexuality. What we're going to do is we're going to start with 4 human insights. And these 4 human insights are just to give us a sense of there's something very sacred. We want to treat the subject with great reverence. And then we're going to move to the more important part. We're going to look at Jesus' example to find out how can we love authentically. So the first human insight is from the philosopher Michael Puckaluk. So he notes that in every society there is a recognition between the difference between a physical assault and a sexual assault. So why is there a difference? Because both are hurting the human body. So why the difference? Because whenever you hurt someone's sexual organs, you're causing greater damage. So we know from experience that if someone hurts us in a sexual way, there's more emotional, psychological, and even spiritual damage. So that's telling us that there's something unique about the sexual organs. There's a connection even to the spiritual realm. That's why we want to treat it with reverence. And so reverence is like a spiritual category. A second insight, the theologian Christopher West, he notes that in every language there are multiple names for our sexual organs. But there's no other name for elbow. An elbow's an elbow, right? We don't have other names for it. A uterus is a uterus. But when it comes to our sexual organs, in every language, we often have all these names. Often they're very crude. Why is that? Because the sexual organs are unique. Third insight, the pleasure produced by our sexual organs is different than the pleasure produced by the rest of our body. So people can get addicted to sex or to pornography or to touching themselves sexually. But no one gets addicted to getting a massage. Massages are good, but no one actually ever watches videos of someone else getting massage. It's true. But people watch other people engaged in sexual activity. Why is that? Well, okay, the sexual pleasure produced is completely different. Now, this is really important because our society, I think wrongly, it says, well, when you have a sexual urge, it's just like every other physical urge. If you have a scratch, if you have an itch, you scratch it. They say, well, do it. They say if you have a sexual urge, you scratch it. And we'd say, actually, no, it's very different. It's completely different. We'll come back to this later. And number 4, many advocates of sexual freedom, they say that shame has been introduced into certain cultures by Christianity. So they point to certain cultures where people wear very little clothing or they might be naked all the time. And they say that shame was introduced to their cultures by Christianity. But the writer, Dawn Eden, she points out that even in those cultures where people wear almost nothing, they still feel uncomfortable if you stare at their private parts. That's interesting. And that points to the fact that our private parts are sacred. So these 4 reflections, they point to the fact that our sexual organs are deeply personal, unique, powerful, and sacred. And so we shouldn't just treat them like the rest of our body. Well, how should we treat them? Now we move into the scriptures. Jesus says today to his disciples, "These are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms must be fulfilled." Everything written in the 73 books of the Bible over 1,000 years all point to Jesus, and a lot of them even before he was born. They all point to Jesus, and one of the truths about Jesus is that he is the bridegroom. So Jesus is married. To whom? To the church. And so we look at his example and we say, how does he, the bridegroom, love his bride? And if we can understand that, we'll start understanding better how to love each other in a beautiful sexual way. It says, "Then he opened their minds to understand the scriptures, and he said to them, 'Thus it is written, that the Messiah is to suffer and to rise from the dead on the 3rd day.'" So Jesus is opening our minds. He's opening our hearts to understand, because his teaching is very different than everything we've been taught our whole lives. And he tells us that he, the Messiah, has to suffer. Why does he have to suffer? Okay, so his sacrifice on the cross is a kind of gift. When you love someone, you give yourselves to them. Okay? And there are different kinds of gifts. So if I give you $100, good. If I give you $1,000, better. If I give you a year of my time, that's even better. Now, let's say I shield you with my body from, let's say, a gun attack. I'm giving you my body. That's the greatest gift. So Jesus, when he gives his body on the cross, that is the greatest gift. And he says, love one another as I have loved you. Jesus, you're the bridegroom. How do you love us? You give your body for us. So that's a question we're asking. How can I give myself to people the way Jesus, the bridegroom, gives? Now, we asked this question years ago. I'd like to see if you remember the answer to the question. So St. John Paul II said, what is the opposite of love? He said it's not hate. The opposite of love is to use. That's interesting. He said when we don't love someone, we use them in different ways. We might use them or for our own advantage. We might even use their body. Even if we love someone, we might actually do that. We might use their body for our own pleasure. We might even use ourselves to get someone's attention. Well, what's another word for love? It's something we just said, it's to give. When you love someone, you give yourself to them. And the opposite of that is to take. We take from them selfishly. And finally, when we love and give ourselves to people, we sacrifice ourselves for them. What's the opposite of to sacrifice? You lust after someone. Because you sacrifice them for your own selfish pleasure. Jesus then says, repentance and forgiveness of sins is to be proclaimed in his name to all nations, beginning from Jerusalem. You are witnesses of these things. Repentance. We know this great biblical word means to change our heart, to change our mind, to change the way we look at reality. And so, in our fallen human nature, we often experience sexual desire, the desire God gave us, but in an inverted way. We're experiencing it in a way that God never designed us to experience it. I'll give you an example. So years ago, I heard this news story. I find it kind of humorous. So there's this billboard of Janet Jackson on a highway, and there were all these car crashes in front of it. What was happening there? So presumably, all these men are seeing that billboard, they're experiencing sexual desire, and they're not thinking, how can I love this woman as a person? But they should be. When there's a repentance, when there's a redemption, when we experience sexual desire, we should see someone beautiful and say, how can I love that person? What can I do that is good for them? How can I sacrifice myself to make their life better? Let's clarify what we talked about last week, and we're going to keep on going deeper every week just so that we understand better what Jesus is teaching. We talked about impure thoughts last week because Jesus said that you can actually commit adultery in the heart, he said. So if I intentionally lust after someone in my mind, that's a sin. Let's clarify. If a thought comes into my mind, that's not a sin, right? That's just a temptation, right? And you can't control your thoughts 100%, otherwise you'd go crazy. But if a thought comes into our mind, let's say a sexual thought, an impure thought, we're using someone as an object, if I fully consent to it, because there has to be a choice, by definition, in order to have sin, you must have a choice. If I fully consent to that and say, yes, I'm going to objectify that person, that would be a mortal sin according to Jesus' teaching. But let's say that thought comes into my mind and then my conscience goes off and says, this isn't right. I push the thought out of my head, then it comes back. Then I push it out again, and I'm really struggling with it. That's a partial consent, therefore it's a partial sin. It's a venial sin. When it comes to pornography is always grave matter because you're using someone. It's an objectification of a person. So if I freely choose to look at pornography, I intentionally do it, full consent, that's a mortal sin. Let's say something pops up onto my screen, and then I immediately get rid of it. I don't need that. That's not right. That's not a sin at all. Let's say maybe I look at it for a bit and then my conscience goes off. This isn't right. Okay, sounds to me like partial consent, a venial sin. And when it comes to touching ourselves sexually, masturbation, that's also grave matter. Why is that? Why is that wrong? What we were trying to point out earlier when we were talking about the 4 human insights, our sexual organs are unique, they're sacred, they're powerful, and according to biblical teaching, they're meant for marriage. They're not just meant for our own sexual pleasure. That's going to take a lot to unpack. We'll go deeper into that in the future. But we just want to point out for now, that's a very hard sin to overcome, admittedly. And so that's why we always want to go to Jesus in prayer. We want to go to confession just to start again, over and over again. And we should never get discouraged. We said last week, I was going to give you a list of saints who overcame their lust. So here we go. So we have Saint Mary of Egypt. We have Saint Thea, Saint Pelagia. All of them, at one point in their lives, they sold their bodies to other people. But they're saints now. Then we have Saint Augustine, Mary of Edessa, Ignatius of Loyola, Margaret of Cortona, Angela Foligno, Charles de Foucault. All of them used to use people sexually. And I find it so beautiful that someone like St. Augustine, who struggled for 15 years with lust, he goes on to become the saint of purity of heart. So I think it's really interesting. Often the thing that we struggle with most, when God overcomes it, we become known for that virtue. So St. Augustine is known for his purity of heart. So he wrote in his confessions, he said to God the Father, he says, "Late have I loved you, O beauty ever ancient, ever new. Late have I loved you." So there's always hope. Jesus talks about us being his witnesses. When we talk about being a witness, we're not just saying, okay, this is what I saw. It's more than that. It's saying, this is what I've experienced. So when we start loving the way Jesus wants us to love, this is really exciting. So we get to go around all day saying, how can I love that person? How can I love you? How can I do something good for you? Well, maybe I'm going to affirm you. I'm going to encourage you. I'm going to challenge you. I'm going to give you an affectionate hug. I'm going to spend time with you. I'm going to give you a gift. I'm going to do something that you need. This is exciting. This is great. I want to be a witness to that kind of love. Finally, it says, "Then he led them out as far as Bethany, and lifting up his hands, he blessed them. While he was blessing them, he withdrew from them and was carried up into heaven. And they worshipped him and returned to Jerusalem with great joy." You would think that the disciples would be sad. Jesus is leaving them. Why are they sad? Pope Benedict XVI said, they're not sad, they're full of joy because Jesus is close to us in a new way. So today we're celebrating the ascension. Jesus goes to heaven, but he's close to us in a new way, dwelling in our souls. And he's helping us to uphold each other's dignity. So again, we get to go around all day thinking, how can I give myself to other people the way Christ the bridegroom did?